Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, by Jared M. Diamond. Picture two farms, thousands of miles apart, yet eerily similar in almost every way. The first is a modern dairy farm in Montana. Let's call it Hull's Farm. It's run by a hard-working family, and it's absolutely thriving with cutting-edge technology. The barns gleam, the pastures are lush and green, and the owners are pillars of their community. From any angle, it looks like the very definition of the American dream, a symbol of prosperity in the most powerful nation on earth. Now, travel back in time and across the ocean to another farm, Gardar Farm, nestled in the dramatic fjords of southwestern Greenland. Centuries ago, it too was the crown jewel of its region. Its massive stone barn, the largest for miles around, sheltered a thriving herd of dairy cows. Its owner was a powerful bishop who commanded respect throughout the land. The farm sat against a backdrop of breathtaking mountains and icy waters. At first glance, these two farms could be twins separated only by the centuries between them. They shared the same strengths: wealth, advanced technology, influential leadership. They also faced remarkably similar challenges. Both dealt with brutally short growing seasons. Both were far from the major markets where they sold their products. Both were vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control, from unpredictable weather to distant political upheavals. But here's the thing that changes everything. Hull's Farm is flourishing today. It's actually growing and expanding. Gardar Farm, it's nothing but ruins now. The stone walls still stand like a skeleton on the landscape, but the farm was abandoned over 500 years ago. The entire Norse Greenland society didn't just decline, it vanished completely. Every single person either starved, fled, or died until no one remained. At the height of their civilization, the idea that Norse Greenland could collapse would have seemed as impossible as the collapse of America seems to us right now. This single haunting comparison unlocks the central mystery of one of the most important books of our time, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jared Diamond. This isn't just another dusty history book about forgotten peoples. Diamond, a geographer and scientist, spent years traveling the globe, from the haunting ruins of Easter Island to the struggling landscapes of modern China, asking one massive question: why do some societies flourish, while others drive themselves straight into the ground? What he discovered is both terrifying and encouraging. He found a pattern, a set of 5 critical factors that act like a checklist for societal collapse. The same forces that toppled the mighty Maya civilization and the mysterious Anasazi of the American Southwest are at work in our world right this very minute. In this summary, we're going to walk through that checklist together. We'll become detectives, piecing together the final days of vanished civilizations. We'll stand among the giant, mysterious statues of Easter Island and ask ourselves, what were they thinking when they cut down their last tree? We'll sail with the Vikings to Greenland and discover why one group of people survived in the brutal Arctic, while another, with supposedly better technology, died out completely. This journey will do more than satisfy your curiosity. By the time we're done, you'll see the world through completely different eyes. You'll understand that the future isn't something that just happens to us, like rain or sunshine. It's something we actively choose. And the choices we make, both as individuals and as a society, echo through generations. This is the secret of collapse, and more importantly, the secret of survival. Let's begin our journey on the most isolated inhabited place on Earth, Easter Island. Imagine a tiny triangle of volcanic rock sitting in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile. When the first European explorers stumbled upon it on Easter Sunday in 1722, they were absolutely stunned. The island was basically a barren wasteland, virtually treeless and covered in withered grass. A small, impoverished population lived there in leaky canoes that looked like they might sink at any moment. But scattered across this desolate landscape were over 800 gigantic stone statues the famous moai. Some towered 30 feet tall and weighed as much as 80 tons. They'd been carved from a single quarry, somehow transported for miles, and then erected on massive stone platforms. How could a seemingly primitive society, with no wheels, no draft animals, and no strong timber, have pulled off such an incredible feat of engineering? And even more mysteriously, why did they suddenly stop? At the quarry, hundreds of statues sat unfinished, abandoned in mid-creation. Stone tools lay scattered, where workers had simply dropped them. It looked as if the entire civilization had evaporated in a single day. For centuries, the mystery of Easter Island fueled wild theories, ranging from lost South American civilizations to ancient astronauts. But the truth, carefully pieced together by archaeologists, climatologists, and pollen scientists, tells a far more powerful and cautionary story. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived around the year 900, Easter Island was anything but a wasteland. It was actually a subtropical paradise, blanketed in dense forest, dominated by the world's largest palm tree, giants that grew up to 80 feet tall. Those thick trunks were perfect for building large ocean-going canoes and, crucially, for transporting and raising those massive statues. The forest also provided firewood, edible fruits, and fiber for making strong ropes. The island hosted dozens of species of land birds and was the richest seabird breeding site in the entire Pacific. So what on earth happened? This is where we introduce Jared Diamond's first and arguably most critical factor in his 5-point framework for collapse: human environmental damage. The Easter Islanders, like societies everywhere, started using their resources. They cleared parts of the forest to plant gardens for crops like taro, yams, and sweet potatoes. They cut down those giant palm trees to build canoes for fishing and hunting porpoises far offshore, and most fatefully, they cut them down to transport their magnificent statues. For centuries, this system worked beautifully. The population grew steadily, eventually reaching perhaps 15,000 people. Society organized itself into competing clans, each led by a chief. This competition became the engine driving the statue-building craze. Each clan tried desperately to outdo the others by erecting bigger and more impressive moai, monuments to honor their ancestors and show off their power. It became an absolute obsession, a cultural arms race, where prestige was measured in tons of carved stone. The bigger the statue, the more wood and rope you needed. The more food required to feed the workers, the more forest had to be cleared for gardens. It was a textbook case of what Diamond calls creeping normalcy. The forest didn't vanish overnight. It disappeared slowly, tree by tree, over generations. Each year, the change was almost invisible. Only the oldest islanders might remember when the forest was thicker, when the trees stood taller. The younger generations grew up in a world with gradually fewer trees, and that became their version of normal. They probably had no clue they were approaching a point of no return. What did the person who cut down the very last palm tree say? Diamond imagines he probably muttered something like, "What's the big deal? We need it for a statue, and besides, there are probably more trees on the other side of the island." But there weren't any more trees. Not anywhere. The complete deforestation of Easter Island, likely finished by the 1600s, set off a catastrophic domino effect. Without large trees, they could no longer build sturdy, ocean-going canoes. This meant they couldn't hunt porpoises anymore, which had been a major protein source. It also meant they were completely trapped. There was absolutely no escape. Without trees, they lost their main source of firewood. They were reduced to burning grasses and scrubby shrubs. Without the protective forest canopy, the fertile volcanic soil, now exposed to wind and rain, began washing away. Crop yields plummeted. Springs dried up. The bird populations, both land birds and seabirds, were hunted to extinction. Their nests were raided by rats that had arrived with the first settlers, and whose populations exploded without any predators to control them. The society that had built those magnificent moai began to starve. Archaeological evidence from the final centuries paints a truly grim picture. The islanders' diet shifted from porpoise and birds to almost exclusively chicken, and eventually to something much darker, human flesh. Garbage heaps from this period are filled with human bones, cracked open to extract the marrow. The oral traditions that survived are obsessed with cannibalism. The most vicious insult you could hurl at an enemy was, "The flesh of your mother sticks between my teeth." Society descended into complete chaos and civil war. The organized authority of chiefs and priests collapsed, replaced by brutal warrior chiefs. People abandoned their villages and retreated to fortified caves for protection. And in the ultimate act of despair and rage, they turned on the very symbols of their ancestors, power. They started toppling the statues. Clan fought against clan, pulling down each other's moai, often deliberately breaking their necks as they fell. By the time Europeans arrived, every single statue that had once stood proudly on its platform had been thrown down. Easter Island stands as the purest example of a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its resources. It was a collapse in total isolation. They had no one to blame but themselves. But this brings us to the second point in Diamond's framework: climate change. While there's no solid evidence of a major climate shift on Easter Island itself, in many other societal collapses, changing climate acted as the final push over the edge. Think of it this way. A society can often handle one major problem, like deforestation. But what happens when that self-inflicted wound gets combined with an external shock, like a brutal, prolonged drought? This is exactly what happened to the Anasazi, the ancient ones, who built those spectacular cliff dwellings in the American Southwest, places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. For centuries, they were absolute masters of desert farming. They built complex irrigation systems and somehow managed to support a large population in an incredibly dry, fragile environment. But like the Easter Islanders, they faced a serious wood crisis. As their population exploded, they cut down the pinyon and juniper forests surrounding their settlements for construction beams and firewood. Tree ring data, an incredibly precise natural clock that tells us not only the exact year a tree was cut, but also how much rain fell that year, shows that they eventually had to travel farther and farther, up to 50 miles away, to get the massive logs needed for their great houses. Then, around the year 1130, a severe and prolonged drought slammed the region. It wasn't the first drought they'd faced, but this time was different. Their population was at its absolute peak. Their forests were severely depleted. They were already living right on the edge. The drought was the final blow that pushed their fragile agricultural system past the breaking point. Within just a few decades, the great centers like Chaco Canyon were completely abandoned. Society didn't just shrink, it collapsed entirely. The lesson here cuts deep. It's rarely just one thing that brings a society down. It's often the deadly combination of self-inflicted environmental damage and a natural climate shift. The society weakens itself first, and then nature delivers the knockout punch. But the story of collapse isn't just about what happens inside a society's borders. It's also about its neighbors. This brings us to the third and fourth points of Diamond's framework: relations with hostile neighbors, and, just as importantly, the loss of support from friendly neighbors. Let's look at the interconnected story of three tiny islands in the same remote corner of the Pacific as Easter Island: Mangareva, Pitcairn, and Henderson. Mangareva was the regional powerhouse. It was a volcanic island with fertile soil and a large, sheltered lagoon absolutely teeming with fish and, most importantly, black-lipped pearl oysters. The shells of these oysters were thick and incredibly strong, perfect for making essential tools like fishhooks, adzes, and scrapers. Its one major weakness? It had absolutely no high-quality stone for making heavy-duty tools. About 300 miles away sat Pitcairn Island. Yes, the very same island where the mutineers of the famous Bounty would later hide out. Pitcairn was smaller and much steeper than Mangareva, with pretty limited farmland. But it held a treasure, a quarry of fine-grained volcanic stone, absolutely perfect for making the sharp, durable adzes that Mangareva desperately lacked. Another 100 miles past Pitcairn lay Henderson Island. Henderson was the largest of the three, but also the most marginal for human life. It was an uplifted coral reef, meaning it had no stone at all, no fresh water, and only tiny pockets of soil. But it was a paradise for birds, hosting massive colonies of seabirds and several species of flightless land birds. It was also the only turtle-nesting beach in the entire region. For centuries, these three islands formed a miniature trading empire. Mangareva, the population hub, sent essential supplies, crops, pigs, and even people, to the smaller islands. They also exported their precious oyster shells. In return, Pitcairn supplied the entire region with high-quality stone tools. And Henderson likely exported live sea turtles and beautiful red parrot feathers, both luxury goods, highly prized by the chiefs on Mangareva. It was a perfectly balanced system. The small, resource-poor islands of Pitcairn and Henderson could only survive because of their lifeline to their larger, more prosperous neighbor. But then disaster struck on Mangareva. Just like on Easter Island, Mangareva's population kept growing. They cleared their forests for agriculture, and the soil on the steep hillsides started eroding directly into the lagoon. This erosion had two devastating effects. First, it destroyed their farmland. Second, the sediment choked the lagoon, killing off the oyster beds. Mangareva had destroyed the two pillars of its entire economy, the land and the sea. Society descended into chaos, warfare, and cannibalism. And most critically, with their forests gone, they could no longer build the large, ocean-going canoes needed for the long-distance trade voyages to Pitcairn and Henderson. The lifeline was cut. On Pitcairn and Henderson, the consequences were absolutely fatal. The people of Henderson, now completely trapped, were suddenly without any stone for tools, except for what they could improvise from giant clamshells. Their tiny population, probably never more than a few dozen people, simply couldn't survive in isolation. The people of Pitcairn faced the same fate. Sometime between 1500 and 1790, both islands went silent. The last person died, and their societies vanished completely. This offers a chilling preview of the dangers of globalization. Today, our entire world is interconnected, just like that little island network. We in the developed world depend on resources from developing countries, and they depend on us for trade and markets. The story of Henderson Island demonstrates how a society can collapse, not just because of its own mistakes, but because its essential trading partner collapsed first. Now let's journey to the icy waters of the North Atlantic, to the story of the Greenland Norse. This is perhaps the most complex and fascinating collapse Diamond explores, because it involves all 5 points of his framework working together. Around the year 984, the famous Viking Eric the Red, a murderer who'd been exiled from both Norway and Iceland, led a group of settlers to Greenland. They arrived during a period of relatively mild climate, known as the medieval warm period. They found what seemed like an absolute promised land, lush green pastures, nestled in the deep, sheltered fjords of the southwest coast. It looked just like their homeland in Norway. They established a fully European society perched on the edge of the Arctic. They were farmers who raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They were devout Christians who built dozens of churches and even an impressive cathedral. They were proud Europeans who dressed in the latest European fashions, traded regularly with Norway for iron and timber, and exported valuable goods like walrus tusks and polar bear skins back home. For an impressive 450 years, they survived and even thrived. And then they vanished completely. So what went wrong? Let's run through the checklist. First, environmental damage. Like their cousins in Iceland, the Norse brought a complete European farming package to an incredibly fragile Arctic environment. They cleared the native birch and willow woodlands to create pasture. Their cattle and sheep overgrazed the thin soil, leading to massive erosion. In an environment with such a brutally short growing season, the landscape simply couldn't recover fast enough. They were slowly but surely destroying the very foundation of their farming life. Second, climate change. Around 1300, the medieval warm period began fading away, and the world entered what we now call the Little Ice Age. Greenland's summers became shorter and cooler. Growing enough hay to feed their livestock through the long, harsh winters became increasingly difficult and eventually practically impossible. The sea ice also increased dramatically, making the voyage to and from Norway more dangerous and sometimes cutting off trade completely for years at a time. Third, the loss of friendly contacts. As the climate worsened and sea ice grew, trade with Norway dwindled significantly. Then, in 1349, the Black Death swept through Europe, killing roughly half of Norway's entire population. A devastated Norway had fewer resources, and honestly less reason to send ships on the increasingly perilous journey to its remote Greenland colony. The lifeline of iron, timber, and cultural connection began to seriously fray. Fourth, hostile neighbors. The Norse weren't alone in Greenland. Around the year 1200, another people arrived, the Inuit. The Inuit were absolute masters of Arctic survival. They had sophisticated technology perfectly adapted to the harsh environment, kayaks for hunting seals in open water, specialized harpoons, dog sleds for efficient winter travel, and warm, completely waterproof clothing made of sealskin. They could genuinely thrive in conditions that were absolutely deadly for the Norse. The Norse, however, viewed the Inuit as skrælings, a deeply derogatory term meaning wretches or savages. The Inuit were pagan, and the Norse were proudly Christian. There's almost no archaeological evidence whatsoever of trade or cultural exchange between the two groups. The Norse stubbornly refused to learn from the Inuit. They never adopted the kayak, the specialized harpoon, or the ringed seal hunting techniques that could have literally saved their lives. Instead, there was conflict. Sagas and archaeological evidence point to violent clashes, with the Inuit, who were more numerous and far better adapted to the environment, usually holding the upper hand. This brings us to the fifth and final point in Diamond's framework, and perhaps the most crucial of all, the society's response to its problems. The Greenland Norse failed because they were completely trapped by their own values. Their entire identity was rooted in being European farmers and Christians. To them, being a real Greenlander meant raising cattle, even when it became economically disastrous. It meant building massive stone churches, even when resources were desperately scarce. It meant stubbornly clinging to a European diet, and actively despising the seal and fish-based diet of the Inuit, even when they were literally starving to death. Their core values, the very things that had given them the strength and social cohesion to survive for centuries, became a cultural straitjacket that prevented them from adapting. They were so deeply committed to their identity that they essentially chose to die as Christian farmers rather than survive as something else. The final years of the Western settlement, the more northern and marginal of the two Norse colonies, provide a truly horrifying testament to this. Archaeological digs at the last farms show that in their final winter, the people ate their prized dairy cows, then their sheep and goats, and finally, their own hunting dogs. They were starving to death in a land of plenty, surrounded by the seals and fish that the Inuit were successfully hunting just miles away. The Inuit, by stark contrast, survived and thrived, They had the right technology, the right social structure, and most importantly, the right mindset for the environment. The story of Greenland delivers the ultimate lesson that in a harsh environment, it's not just your resources that determine survival, it's your choices and your willingness to adapt. So far, we've focused primarily on societies that failed spectacularly, but Diamond makes it crystal clear, collapse is absolutely not inevitable. To prove it, he offers powerful examples of societies that faced severe environmental challenges and actually succeeded. These success stories fall into two broad categories: bottom-up solutions and top-down solutions. A perfect example of a bottom-up success is the tiny island of Tikopia, a minuscule 1.8 square mile speck in the Pacific that has somehow supported a dense population for an incredible 3,000 years. Tikopia is so small that literally everyone knows everyone else. Everyone can see the entire island and clearly understands that their survival depends absolutely on the whole community working together seamlessly. Over the centuries, they developed an incredibly sophisticated system of sustainable agriculture. They essentially transformed the entire island into a multi-layered food forest, brilliantly mimicking a natural rainforest, but with every single plant being either edible or useful. They deeply understood the dangers of overpopulation and consciously controlled their numbers through various means, ranging from contraception to dangerous sea voyages undertaken by young men. And in a moment of truly extraordinary foresight around the year 1600, the chiefs made a collective decision to slaughter every single pig on the island. They realized that the pigs were directly competing with humans for precious food and damaging their carefully tended gardens. It was an incredibly painful, short-term sacrifice made for long-term survival. Because they were a small, tightly knit society with genuinely shared interests, they could make these tough, rational decisions from the bottom up. The opposite approach is top-down management, which tends to work best in large, centralized societies. A prime example is Japan during the Tokugawa era, spanning from 1603 to 1867. In the early 1600s, after a long period of devastating civil war, Japan was facing a massive deforestation crisis. A huge surge in population, combined with enormous construction projects for castles and expanding cities, had stripped the country of its forests at an alarming rate. The consequences were becoming severe: catastrophic soil erosion, devastating floods, and crippling timber shortages. It genuinely looked like Japan was heading straight for an Easter Island-style collapse. But it didn't happen. Why not? The answer lies with the powerful, highly centralized government led by the Tokugawa shoguns. The shoguns had a genuinely long-term view of governance. They weren't just thinking about the next election cycle or even the next few years. They were thinking about preserving their dynasty for centuries to come. They clearly understood that the long-term health and stability of the country were absolutely essential for their own continued power. They implemented a series of strict, top-down policies across the entire nation. They began by carefully regulating logging, dictating precisely who could cut what type of tree, where they could cut it, and when. They controlled wood consumption down to the household level, even specifying exactly how much timber a person of a certain social class could use to build a house. But they didn't just stop at conservation. They began a massive nationwide effort in active reforestation. They essentially developed the science of silviculture, planting and carefully managing forests as a long-term renewable crop. Over the next 2 centuries, Japan dramatically reversed its deforestation crisis. By the 1800s, its wood supply had become truly sustainable, and its forests were actually beginning to recover and expand. It was one of the first great triumphs of modern environmental management anywhere in the world. Japan succeeded because it had strong, wise leadership that could effectively impose solutions from the top down, even when those solutions were initially unpopular. The stories of Tikopia and Tokugawa Japan clearly show that there's more than one viable path to success. But both approaches required the society to correctly perceive its problems, and to have the genuine political will to make painful but absolutely necessary choices. This brings us to the final and most important question of all. What do these stories of past societies, both dramatic failures and remarkable successes, actually mean for us today? Are we the Easter Islanders blindly consuming our resources on an inevitable path to self-destruction? Or are we the Tokugawa Japanese, possessing the wisdom and foresight to dramatically change course before it's too late? Diamond argues persuasively that our modern, globalized world is facing essentially the same 12 fundamental environmental problems that past societies faced, plus we've added several entirely new ones to the mix. Problems like widespread deforestation, severe soil erosion, and critical water shortages are still very much with us. But now we've layered on new threats like human-caused climate change, the dangerous buildup of toxic chemicals in our environment, and the stark fact that we're rapidly approaching the absolute limit of the Earth's photosynthetic capacity to support us. To make this uncomfortably real, Diamond brings the story right home. He starts with a place that seems like the complete opposite of a collapsing society, modern Montana. It's part of the richest country in the entire world, sparsely populated, and absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. Yet even in Montana, the cracks are beginning to clearly show. Toxic waste from abandoned old mines is poisoning entire river systems. Forests are seriously mismanaged, leading to increasingly catastrophic wildfires. Water is becoming genuinely scarce and contested, and the traditional economy built on mining, logging, and farming is in serious decline, creating intense social tension between old-timers and wealthy newcomers buying up the land. If even Montana, with all its advantages, has these mounting problems, Diamond asks pointedly, how much more serious must they be in the rest of the world? The answer becomes starkly clear in places like modern Rwanda. The absolutely horrific genocide of 1994 is usually explained simply as a result of deep ethnic hatred between Hutu and Tutsi groups. But Diamond reveals a much deeper, darker Malthusian trigger lurking beneath the surface. Rwanda is one of the most densely populated countries on the entire planet. By the 1990s, the average family farm had shrunk to an absolutely tiny plot, nowhere near enough land to adequately feed a family. People were chronically hungry and increasingly desperate. Land disputes between neighbors, and even within families, were becoming genuinely explosive. The cynical political leaders simply used existing ethnic hatred as the match to light the fire. But the real powder keg was crushing population pressure, combined with severe environmental degradation. As one survivor bleakly explained it, the people whose children had to walk barefoot to school killed the people who could buy shoes for theirs. Perhaps the most visually powerful modern comparison is the island of Hispaniola, shared by two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. From an airplane, the border between them appears as a stark, shocking line. The Dominican side looks green and still reasonably forested. The Haitian side looks brown, barren, and almost lunar. Haiti is the poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere, suffering from extreme deforestation, catastrophic soil erosion, and chronic political instability. The Dominican Republic, while still relatively poor, is dramatically better off. It has a steadily growing economy, and has actually managed to protect a significant portion of its remaining forests. Why such a stark difference when they share the same island? It's not purely the environment, though the Dominican side does receive somewhat more rain. The real answer lies in their dramatically different histories and policy choices. Haiti's brutal history of extreme exploitation under French colonial rule, followed by centuries of corrupt and actively predatory governments, led to an absolutely relentless assault on its natural resources. The Dominican Republic, in contrast, had a somewhat less intensive colonial history, and quite crucially, had two dictators, Trujillo and Balaguer, who, for their own entirely selfish reasons, actually enforced some meaningful measure of forest protection. Balaguer, in particular, was basically an environmentalist dictator who used the army to aggressively stop illegal logging and establish a comprehensive system of national parks. It's a morally complex and ambiguous story, but it clearly proves that leadership choices and policy decisions can create dramatically different outcomes, even in essentially the same environment. Finally, Diamond examines the two giants that will absolutely shape the 21st century, China and Australia. China is what he calls the lurching giant. With the world's largest population and fastest-growing economy, its environmental problems are on a scale literally never before seen in all of human history. It suffers from some of the world's worst air and water pollution, massive ongoing soil erosion, and is now undertaking absolutely colossal engineering projects like the Three Gorges Dam, with truly enormous environmental consequences that we're only beginning to understand. The choices China makes over the coming decades will profoundly affect the entire planet, not just China itself. If 1.3 billion people somehow achieve a full first-world standard of living, with all its associated levels of consumption and waste, the resulting strain on the world's finite resources will be genuinely unimaginable. Australia, on the other hand, serves as the canary in the coal mine for the developed First World. It's undeniably a rich, highly developed country, but it sits precariously on the world's most fragile and nutrient-poor continent. Australia is essentially mining its resources, its thin soil, its scarce water, its already stressed fisheries, at a clearly unsustainable rate. Problems like widespread salinization, caused by extensive land clearing for agriculture, are steadily destroying vast areas of its very best farmland. Australia's unfolding story serves as a stark warning that even wealthy, highly educated societies are definitely not immune to the harsh consequences of ignoring environmental realities. So after this extensive journey through centuries of human history, spanning triumph and tragedy, what are we supposed to conclude? Are we simply doomed to repeat these mistakes? Diamond's answer is a firm and resounding no. He calls himself a cautious optimist. He's cautious because the problems we face are genuinely immense and frighteningly urgent. The time bombs are actively ticking right now. We are absolutely on an unsustainable course if we don't change direction. But he remains an optimist for two genuinely powerful reasons. First, we are literally the first society in all of human history that has the genuine ability to learn systematically from the mistakes of past societies. The Easter Islanders had no books warning them about other societies that had previously collapsed from deforestation. The Maya had no idea what had happened to the Anasazi before them. But we do. We have the sophisticated science of archaeology, we have detailed written history, and we have instantaneous global communication networks. We can clearly see the patterns emerging if we choose to look. Second, and perhaps most importantly, our problems are fundamentally of our own making. This isn't a massive meteor hurtling towards Earth that we're completely powerless to stop. We are the ones actively cutting down the forests, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and systematically overfishing the oceans. And precisely because we are the cause, we can also be the solution. We genuinely have both the knowledge and the technology right now to change course dramatically. The only thing we actually need is the political and social will to actually do it. The story of human history on this planet really isn't just a depressing story of collapse and failure. It's also a genuinely inspiring story of resilience, remarkable ingenuity, and the courage to make difficult choices when they matter most. From the Tokopian chiefs who voluntarily gave up their culturally prized pigs, to the Tokugawa shoguns who successfully saved Japan's forests through wise long-term planning, to the modern environmental movements steadily gaining strength around the world today, there are countless inspiring examples of people who clearly saw a serious problem developing and actively chose to solve it before disaster struck. The future of our own society is definitely not written in stone or predetermined by fate. It will be the direct result of the choices we make right here, right now, in our own time. As we wrap up our journey through Jared Diamond's remarkable book Collapse, it's completely natural to feel a complex mix of awe and anxiety. The stories of these fallen civilizations really do feel like ghost stories crafted specifically for our modern world. haunting reminders of what can genuinely happen when societies lose their way. But I genuinely believe this book is fundamentally a story of hope, not despair. The most powerful lesson for me personally is that history truly isn't just a random collection of unfortunate accidents. There are clear patterns we can identify. The 5-point framework: environmental damage, climate change, hostile neighbors, loss of friendly trade partners, and crucially, a society's response to its challenges, is much more than just a useful historical analysis tool. It's actually a lens through which we can see our own contemporary world far more clearly. It helps us understand that the troubling headlines we read every single day about climate change, resource conflicts, and political instability aren't just isolated random events. They're actually symptoms of the same underlying pressures that have challenged human societies for thousands of years. What strikes me as particularly haunting is the recurring theme of creeping normalcy throughout these stories. No society ever consciously chooses to collapse. The Easter Islanders definitely didn't hold a democratic meeting and collectively vote to cut down their last precious tree. The Maya didn't formally decide to abandon their magnificent cities. It happened gradually, almost invisibly, through a long series of small, seemingly rational decisions made by ordinary people who were honestly just trying to get through the day, the year, or their own lifetime. The world they were slowly creating was subtly, almost imperceptibly different from the world of their parents and grandparents, and by the time the crisis became completely obvious to everyone, it was usually far too late to reverse course. This is genuinely the great danger we face in our own time. Our world is changing faster than ever before in human history, but our brains are still fundamentally wired to respond primarily to immediate, clearly visible threats, like the proverbial tiger in the bushes, not to the slow, largely invisible rise of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. The real challenge we face is learning to see these slow-moving crises for exactly what they are, and to act decisively on them before they become completely irreversible. And this is precisely where the hope comes shining through. Unlike literally any society before us in all of human history, we have access to the knowledge. We have detailed data from ice cores drilled deep in Greenland, from tree rings in the American Southwest, and from satellite images monitoring the Amazon in real time. We have the carefully documented stories of what worked and what failed. We have the unprecedented ability to communicate globally in mere seconds. We are, as Diamond says, genuinely the first generation that has the actual capacity to make truly conscious, informed choices about our collective future on a truly global scale. So what can you, as a young person standing on the verge of actively shaping the 21st century, actually do with this knowledge? It can definitely feel completely overwhelming at first, but the book offers a genuinely clear path forward. The solutions, much like the problems themselves, exist simultaneously at both the top-down and bottom-up levels. From the top down, it means actively demanding much more from our leaders at all levels. It means supporting and voting for leaders who genuinely practice long-term thinking, who aren't just obsessively focused on the next election cycle, but on the kind of world we will leave for the next generation and beyond. It means persistently advocating for policies that intelligently align the short-term interests of businesses and individuals with the genuine long-term interests of society as a whole. But perhaps even more powerfully, meaningful change starts from the bottom up. It genuinely starts with us as individuals. It starts with the daily choices we make as consumers, what we buy, who we choose to buy it from, and honestly, how much we actually consume. Major companies like Home Depot and Unilever didn't fundamentally change their environmental practices just because it was abstractly the right thing to do. They changed because their customers actively demanded it through their purchasing decisions. Your individual choices, when multiplied by millions of other people making similar choices, genuinely have immense power to reshape entire industries. It also starts right in our own communities. The inspiring stories of Tekopia and the New Guinea Highlanders clearly demonstrate the incredible strength of small, tightly cohesive groups working together persistently for a genuine common good. Find your community, whatever that means for you. Get meaningfully involved. Whether it's a local conservation project, a campus environmental group, or even just a committed group of friends deciding together to live more sustainably, collective action is genuinely where real, lasting change actually begins. Ultimately, the core message of Collapse really isn't one of inevitable doom, but of genuine responsibility and meaningful choice. The societies that failed catastrophically were almost always the ones that became rigid and inflexible, that stubbornly clung to their old ways and deeply held values, even when the world around them was obviously changing. The societies that succeeded and thrived were consistently the ones that remained flexible and genuinely adaptable, that had the real courage to honestly re-examine their very deepest beliefs when circumstances demanded it. That was the comprehensive book summary of Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed by Jared Diamond. We've journeyed through the key highlights together today, but I honestly have to be upfront with you. Even a detailed summary like this can only take you so far. The real magic genuinely happens when you sit down and read the book for yourself at your own pace. It's in those quiet moments when a particular story, or even a simple phrase, suddenly connects with something deep inside you in a way you didn't expect at all. This summary is specifically designed to help you decide whether this book is truly worth your valuable time. If literally anything we've talked about today has resonated with you even slightly, I truly encourage you to grab a copy and experience it yourself. Reading it isn't just about passively learning facts and figures. It's a genuine experience that can authentically change the way you see the entire world and your own place in it. A direct link to the book is waiting for you in the description below. Also, if you found this summary genuinely valuable and it gave you something meaningful to think about, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you definitely won't miss our next journey into another potentially life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together on this journey.